Now, both players can breathe a sigh of relief there because Hikaru was worse, but he also had a shot with Queen F4. And Magnus down in time trouble saying, my mouse speed is there. I can hang with Hikaru Nakamura, and it's not just a hoodie hanging on my head. So we see that it's 1-1, great defense from both, and we are just getting started. Danya, still 68.5 minutes remaining in the longest time control.
Neither of the players able to land a punch in the first two games. Magnus came oh so close in that game. It was an exquisite positional effort. He outplayed Hikaru in his pet King's Indian. But at the end of the day, Robert, if you think about Hikaru's greatest strength, what does he have to harness in order to try to knock the world champion out of the SCC and claim the title for himself? It's his time scrambling ability. I think that is Hikaru's biggest objective edge over Magnus. When Hikaru is in top form, his time scrambling is unbelievable.
Yeah, it's really tough to match up with Magnus Carlsen, but Hikaru Nakamura proving he's capable of doing just that. We are in our third game of the match. We see that we had a Queen's Gambit accepted. So what's the dynamic right now? White has an extra pawn in the center, E3 and D4 versus just a single pawn E6. White is castled. The Black King is in the center. But what does Black have going for him? No actual targets, no weaknesses in the position. But Danya, Magnus is thinking. He's spending a lot of time here. Is he unfamiliar with this setup?
Well, I'm sure he's had this before in OTB chess. I think what he's really trying to decide is whether to push b5. And I'm going to echo a point you made in an earlier broadcast in a galaxy far, far away. If you play b5 prematurely and the bishop drops back, White has this idea of pushing a2, a4 and carving out a very nice c4 square for his knight. So you actually see Magnus delaying the move b5, and you might even see him playing the more modest b6.
Right. B5 is an idea for Black, and that's why White plays A4 to stop it, but it gives up a key square. So let's see what Hikaru Nakamura has in mind. He's also being a bit slow, deliberate here, taking his time, longest time control. He's used to winning with 5 seconds on the clock. When he starts with 5 minutes, well, that's quite a lot of time. He chooses A4. So what this was an approach. Does he want to give up control of B4? The answer happens to be yes, but he is taking squares away from Black on the queen side.
And it's not enough just to see, oh, I weakened a square. How accessible is that square? It's not that easy for Black to get a knight to b4. And even if he does, it's not the end of the world for White. A knight on b4 looks pretty, but it's not really impacting the course of the game. So I like the decision to prevent b5. I think White's got a tiny pull here. Magnus has to be very careful about the d4, d5 pawn break, which is especially strong if you play b6. Okay, Magnus takes on d4, and we get a new pawn structure.
I think you can play the move knight to e5. The bishop on c8 wants to get out. The move b6 would be a blunder because it gives White the c6 square. So that's why knight e5 with tempo against the bishop. Now bishop d7. And Danya, I feel like these positions can get very dangerous for White. The reason why is that b4 square and the b3 pawn. At some point, if Black gets developed and coordinated, the b3 pawn is an approachable target, whereas b7, the bishop needs to get to f3. Easier said than done when there's a knight sitting on e5.
You're absolutely right. Objectively, the position is clearly equal. The engine's always going to throw 0.00 in these positions, but I agree completely. White is the only one with a serious target and a seriously weak square. The b4 square can be occupied by a bishop rather than a knight as originally anticipated. And Magnus, you know what he could do here? He could take on f3 and then play bishop c6 to try to open up the b file, but instead he decides to keep all of the pieces on the board with knight g6.
Yeah, because surprisingly, White is the one with less space, and the position is pretty open. So knight g6 keeping more piece on the board is saying that bishop on e2 desperately wants to get to f3, not so fast. Now, if you go knight d4 back, we could see a repetition of moves with knight back to e5, or you read my mind once again, partner, pawn to e5 is available for Black. So queen b1, an odd-looking move, Danya. What's the purpose behind it?
Well, it could be to prepare knight c3 to e4, and the purpose of that not only to relieve the pressure a little bit by trading a pair of binder pieces, but White's greatest asset, arguably, is his dark squared bishop sitting pretty on the long diagonal. It's definitely better placed than Black's bishop. So knight e4 is an attempt maybe to accentuate your strengths and minimize your weaknesses, but there's a lot of logistical problems with it. Black can take and then throw bishop c6 with tempo. Hikaru instead, where is he going? Is he going to c4? But then he's walking into queen g5.
I think he
Uh-oh.
overlooked the queen sliding across the fifth rank. He plays bishop f3, but this is just the start of white's troubles. The reason why are the squares, the control, and the coordination, the connection between the rooks in a and f8, Danya. The rook can go to d8 right now, and look at the rook on a1. It's boxed in by that queen on b1. So queen b1 had the point of knight e4. It wasn't played, and now we see why it's going to backfire.
Hikaru definitely under pressure. That queen will have to move out of the way to make space for the rook, but where do you move it? Do you go to a2? Well, that looks ugly. If you go to c2, you walk into a pin. If you go to d3, you walk into rook fd8. So white's queen, surprisingly, is feeling mighty uncomfortable on b1, and Magnus could target that b3 pawn with a well-timed queen d5 or queen b4.
Queen d5 looks like the next move for black. So I think white should play the move rook to d1, challenge the d file, because if you can start swapping off pieces, your problems are not as significant. How do you attack b3? You need queens on the board. It's the only piece for black that can attack it. So if you could first trade rooks, then trade queens, you just feel like your problems are not so significant. So rook d1, an excellent choice. And a move for black, I don't know if it's good right now. I was going to say knight to d5. He chooses queen d5. Then I feel like Magnus, when he has the black pieces, he's not necessarily trying to win. He's just trying to play good, solid chess. And if it's a draw, he gets the white piece in the first move advantage next game.
You read my mind. Again, I was literally about to say, is it fair to say, and I don't like to make these general pronouncements, but it does seem like Magnus is playing with an abundance of caution early in the match. He wants to get his feet under him, and he really wants to press with the white pieces as he did in the previous game. I think he judges that he's got the edge on Hikaru's opening repertoire with 1d4. And can Magnus force the rook trade with rook d8 here? Is that the best option? Or is it to play rook c2?
Rook d8 looks like just a simplification, forcing the rooks off. The problem there, though, is that the dark square bishop, white has light square pawns. So does black. So that means if the knights can hop in, maybe white has a chance to win that game. That is not going to happen because it's nowhere near attacking those pawns on the queen side. But at least from a practical perspective, it's only white who would have winning chances at rook d8.
And that's why I'm always worried about these approaches. When you try to go for simplification and you're essentially playing for a draw, you're giving Hikaru exactly what he wants. Maybe a tiny, tiny pull in the endgame, but Hikaru's got to be feeling really the most comfortable he's felt all game, Robert, especially compared to what he had in the middle game. And there he goes, grabbing space with a furious pawn march. He might follow up with g5 and h4.
I love it and hate it at the same time. And the reason why, I like the aggression, the ambition. What I don't like is the overextension, because that pawn on g4 could be a target if you're not looking out for it, especially if you push it to g5. Then your knight is stuck in place on f3 defending that pawn. So I feel like with black's last move, king to f8, king e8 next, that rook is going to be booted from the 7th rank. And then I feel like most of black's problems are behind him. And then it's maybe Magnus who can say, I'm going to play for a win now.
The pendulum continues to swing. I was really under the influence, under the spell of that rook on the 7th, but can you really blame me? Bishop to d8 sends the rook packing. But Magnus is actually not necessarily in a hurry. He might throw in a move like h6 if he wants to stop g5. You could also consider knight e7 to d5 because bishop d8 does compromise the activity of black's bishop, if only temporarily. Knight e7 is on the board.
Knight e7 to d5, going from the king side towards the center. And if g5, knight d5, there might be g takes f6. It looks like white's about to get a new queen, but unfortunately for him, once the king slides off the last rank, that pawn is stopped. But it's close there. You need to be very, very careful, looking out for the tactics.
Let's show that on the analysis board as Hikaru ponders his next move. He's definitely calculating g5, knight d5, g takes f6. You give up the rook on c7. It looks like promotion is unstoppable, but whoop! In comes the rook to the rescue, and white can play something like knight f4 knight h5, Robert, but it's become very clear that white is firmly on the defensive here, and something like knight d5 to f6 knocks the knight out of h5 and picks up the g-pawn. This is not an option. You can play g5, but you definitely can't give up the rook. Back to the live position, where Hikaru is still contemplating his next move.
Yeah, no, this g5 is played, and it's just like what we're talking about. The pawn on g5 is actually quite a strength because the rook can come to h4 if black's not looking out for it, and then h7 falls. But if you retreat the bishop on its diagonal, to say the square e7 or d8, as he just played, if rook h4, you have this move pawn h6, but the reason why you have it is the same exact idea, where the king slides up at the end, and so the passed pawn doesn't become a queen.
I forgot that bishop actually moved away from d8 for a second, got excited there. Rook h4, h6 is a tactical mechanism. Otherwise, black would lose that corner pawn. But I always get concerned, Robert.
Robert.
Hello, Robin, my new commentator. When you're hanging on the basis of a tactical mechanism like this, because it's very easy to forget about it. And the moment you move the bishop, that rook is flying to h4. Both sides now down under a minute.
Knight b6 played, rook h4 is still met, but pawn to h6. It might be a worthy sacrifice at some point.
At this point, yeah.
Magnus, if he just isn't looking out for it, it may hit him and he's going to regret it. But now Hikaru down to 18, 17, 16 seconds, Danya.
He is, and definitely thinking about rook h4, but he's got to make a decision. He drops back to c2, and we are going to get a rook trade.
And look at this. The evaluation is in black's favor. The king can go to d7, to c6, to c5, to b4, and watch out for that b3 pawn. I was saying with liquidation, it shouldn't be much of an issue, but that black king sprints out very quickly.
And a prophylactic move, trying to prevent the knight from accessing the e5 square. On the other hand, this forces black's king in the opposite direction it wants to go. I think Magnus is saying, hey, knight, why don't you attack the queenside pawns? My king is going to stay in the center to defend the kingside pawns. It looks pretty even, but I think Magnus is the one pushing here.
He is. The king can go e6 to d5. You win king of the hill, but you don't win the game. But at least you have some initiative. The h4 pawn cemented on dark square. If f5 is played, the h4 pawn is loose, but f5 weakens e5. That pawn would be hanging. So that's a king e6, but knight c5 check. You can kick the king back and then play knight d3, so you're not going to have to face f5.
And that's precisely what he's going to do. Hikaru obviously fine with the repetition. And Magnus' strategy has been to play with an abundance of caution in these time scrambles. Is he going to accede to the repetition once again? Hikaru's going to be the one to play.
Wow, knight c4,
my gosh.
kicking the knight from d6. And if you swap knight to c4, b7, a6 are loose. And this is what I was saying.
1 second.
Dark square bishop, and those are light square pawns. The king's coming over, knight takes b7.
Magnus is starting to lose control. Can he trap this knight, though? Hikaru can save it with his pawn. c5 and c6. He drives the pawn and he guts off the king.
Yeah, c6, the king cannot get in there. Bishop b6, he needs to go king e6.
Make a move!
The king can't get to the pawn.
Oh, he's going to flag! He's going to flag!
He lost
just
time.